Hi, I'm Patrick Boucousis, the Sales Natural. Best piece of advice from an early mentor. If you're going to be different, first be the same, then be different.
That's interesting advice. Huh.
Yeah.
So first, so early mentor. How early in your career were you? Is it like
When I
first
first
year or
started, it was
something
in
or
my
no?
early 20s. My first job as a salesperson. Yeah, that was just an early piece of advice from from my mentor.
Cool, cool. So
Yeah.
so so let's break that down, right? So to be different, be the same. What? Explain that.
Yeah. So essentially, if you're going to be different, first be the same, then be different. Essentially, it means be relatable. Don't just be different. So if you're talking to someone, don't just go off into the distance because they say, "Where have you gone? I've lost you." So as a salesperson, first be relatable, connect, and then take them on the journey to where different is. I didn't know what he meant when he first said it either, but once he explained it, then it made a lot of sense, and it has ever
Yeah.
since.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that's interesting, right? So one of the ways that we can be the same, right, is we can have standard language. So one of the things that I love that you talk about is value, but
Yeah.
not like anybody else does. So define value, Patrick, and how you're different.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're right. We with a lot of those terms, we sort of have this sense that we understand what they mean. But I think most people have got value wrong, at least in a sales sense. I've got to qualify that because I don't want to redefine the dictionary. And from our salespeople's point of view, I guess the thing to realize about value is that it's received. It's what buyers get after they bought something from you. You could say it's what you're left with when the salesperson has gone or not. So all those expressions like add value, value proposition, creating value are somewhat moot because you can't do that because value, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. They're the arbiter. They decide whether or not they get value.
That's so interesting that we give that to the buyer. So we have to. How do we know what they value though, Patrick? Yeah, right. If you say that, how do we know what they value?
That's a really good question. And really, that's the point. We need to ask them. When we say we're going to add value, create value, we're assuming their perception of value is the same as ours. And it's not. So you end up, traditionally, salespeople have needs discoveries, they have needs conversations. That's kind of where the sales process starts. But what I suggest people ought to do is start with a value discovery. And that just doesn't come on the radar. Needs are like inputs, they're what you get to create an outcome. The outcome is the value. That's what you want to find out about, right? And so a good way to have a value conversation is to say, well, when this system's running the way you'd like it to, what's that going to feel like? What's it going to be like? Or when this production line, when you're in that new building that you want, that I'm helping you to lease, what's it going to feel like working there? Take me for a walk through this building. So it's a
Love that.
case of projecting the buyer into the future, understanding their future state, because that is value. The way where they want to end up is to them value. And so then our job is to see how we can help them go on that journey to get that value.
Wow, that's so different. I've not
Yeah.
heard that before, right? Other than from you, I've not heard this value discovery. So you gave us a couple examples there, right? So if we think about future state, okay, let's take them on the journey, right? And really, what they'll find is the gap, right? That
Yeah,
that kind of some
absolutely.
gap
Value
selling
gap.
there, right? Yeah,
Value
value
gap.
gap. Okay, so that makes sense. So all right, so I've got that. That makes sense to me, right? I understand that. So what if they say they don't know though? Is it the wrong person, or did we ask it wrong, or what happens there?
That's a really great opportunity. With the needs conversation, you typically start from where they're at. But, think of when you're navigating somewhere. Remember the days of paper maps? I know that's a while ago now. But what you did first was you looked at the destination, right? You looked at where you wanted to be, and then you worked back to where you are. Now, with the needs conversation, we tend to start with, well, where they're at. What is your problem? What is your challenge? Instead, ask them, well, where do you want to be? Sort of imagine a world where there is no problem, is no challenge. What's that going to look like? And then having helped them, and oftentimes they're taken aback. They said, well, that's a really good question. Because at the end of the day, that's the why. Why am I doing this? And oftentimes they actually haven't asked that question. But anyway, and then you're having a conversation that engages you with the buyer. You're not talking about products. You're not talking about your services. And so you're non-threatening. You're not being salesy. You're using buyer language. You're in their world. And it's a very quick way to engage. And they come to trust you quickly. So you help them through that process. And as they start to flesh out, or then you start to flesh out. Okay, so if that's happening, what will that mean? Okay, so what if that happens then? Oh, okay, so how would you deal with this? That's the style of conversation, right? And then you gradually work them back from where they want to be back to where they are at the moment. And essentially you've mapped out the journey. That's a high level summary. But
That's really good. Like I said, that's new to me, other than from you. So that's strong, man. So one of the things that feels normal, right? That feels like a real conversation that I'd want to have. And I say that because a lot of times for people, sales conversations feel somewhat forced and like, I have urgency because, it's my month end, it's my quarter end, I'm the sales guy, my reasons. Yeah. So does this turn urgency on its head too, Patrick?
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, well, the interesting thing is that you use the word conversation, and that's what it is. It's a conversation. Whereas the needs exploration, from a buyer's perspective, is a Q&A. It's an interrogation. It's to be endured rather than enjoyed, right? Whereas the value exploration is enjoyable. It's a conversation. It's aspirational. The buyer it gets them out of the problem, gets them right out to this future state. And oftentimes they haven't actually thought about it. That they have a sense what it would be like, but they haven't really sort of fleshed it out. And that's what you help them do. And that of itself is value. You're immediately being of value to them. You're not being a salesperson. There's an immediate deliverable there, an immediate outcome that they're getting that they appreciate. And as I said, it's a conversation. It's not a Q&A.
Wow. So with that, okay, so we define the end. We have that conversation. Is that also where, we ask the question, like, so what might get in the way of this? How might this fail?
Yeah. Let me give you some practical examples of this with people that I've worked with. Commercial photographer. The typical opening for a commercial photographer is someone gets on the phone and says, how much for so many headshots or images of my building or my product or something like that, right? And they're after a price, and they may quote one, but 9 times out of 10 they don't hear back. So now the conversation is, what do you want the images for? Well, we need them for our website. Okay, so how do you want people to feel when they see them? What kind of an impression do you want to create? Oftentimes the person that rang up is a PA or something, just ringing up for some prices. They don't know the answer to the question. She said, well, I don't know. And I said, well, who does know? Can I have a conversation with someone who does? So then they get elevated up to someone who didn't think they were going to get involved in this conversation, who all of a sudden are thinking about the headshots and thinking, well, I just thought I was going to get headshots. And said, well, no, you're creating an impression, right? People are going to form opinions about what your people look like. How would you like that to look? So it's a completely different conversation. And eventually they get to a price. And in this case, he gets about 30% more than he used to for his images. Wow. Similarly, someone in safety systems, again, very commoditized market. He'll ask the question, for example, when someone calls them in to say, look, I need to secure my building or my premises. And he asks, well, what does safe feel like to you? Person's never been asked that question before. The first thing that normally happens is let's go on a tour of the premises. But in terms of, it means that, I'm not going to be concerned that someone's going to knock off the tools out of my workman's toolboxes. And, he starts fleshing out how they feel. And then they just go down the track and he invariably ends up discussing a security system. They don't even discuss prices. He ends up with a job before they even have a quote.
That's so interesting. I mean, that's just so different, Patrick. I've read lots and lots of sales books and talked to lots and lots of salespeople and sold for a long time. And this is the first time that I'm learning about this, and I think it's fascinating that it's turned so much on his head. So I got to ask, like,
it makes sense, doesn't it?
Sure does. Yeah, no, it totally makes sense.
You're helping a buyer achieve an outcome, a result. I might add, though, the other thing that happens, Phil, is that it's a very quick way to qualify. I mean, salespeople, 50% of the deals that salespeople work on, they shouldn't have been in there anyway. But they're so committed to sort of selling it. They just keep on going and going and going, and they end up losing it. So in this situation, you can very quickly qualify, am I going to be able to be a source of value to this person? Just on the basis of the way I'm interacting with them, how they feel, how open they are with me, and all the rest of it. And you can make a judgment fairly quickly to say, I don't think I'm going to be on the same page as this person or get on the same page. So probably qualify out. So it's a much quicker way to qualify as well. So that's the other benefit. You waste a lot less time pursuing things you can't win.
Wow. Wow, yeah, for sure. I mean, it just makes so much sense. We qualify first, can we help them? And secondly, the other part of the qualification is, does this person have enough information to even make a decision? I mean, that's often the
Absolutely.
miss, right? We get to the real buyer, as opposed
Absolutely.
to your point, right? The tire kicker assistant who is just looking to gather 10 prices to get a quote, and then they're going to pick their favorite anyway, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a conversation just the other day, just this week, it's like, with a guy that I'm coaching or mentoring, and he's having a conversation with this government department. They're looking at a really big project. He just went through this why process. So what's going to happen then? What's going to happen then? By the time they finished, they said, I don't know why we're doing this project. Which was a good outcome for them, right? They were all geared up. They had a notional RFP put together, but they hadn't really thought through what the outcome was. I had a really early example of this in a company I went in to run. I took up management of this particular company, and we were working on a whole of government HR and payroll systems for one of the states in Australia. So it's a big deal, right? They were sort of 2 years into this project, and it was a mess. And so I'm a newbie. I went down there and got the team together, and I said, why are we doing this? And the project leader on the other side just exploded, stood up, and I'll leave the expletives out. And he said, what are you asking a question like that for 2 years into the project? I said, well, I'm new, just humor me. The bottom line, Phil, is they hadn't actually thought out a why. The other one was just old, so we need a new one. They hadn't, and that's true of a lot of projects. That's not uncommon. I've come across that a few times. They just start off with the needs, they get into it, they're in the bowels. They hadn't really got up to altitude to say, well, actually, where are we going here?
Yeah. Wow. So when you focus on those outcomes, you can really get to the root of why are we doing this, and
Yeah.
really challenges that. So how do we do that, Patrick, without making that giving that person the ability to save face? I mean, because that's a challenge here. A lot of times,
Yeah.
buyers dig in.
Yeah.
I've walked away from deals, and they're like, no, they're like chasing me. No, we really want to buy. It's like,
Yeah.
I don't really think
Yeah.
this is, we don't have this here. So how do we do that and help them save face?
Okay, so rarely do you end up sort of there's nothing there. That's an extreme example, right? But oftentimes I call it going. So we're typically ground level, right? I call it ground level when we talk about needs, and I say, look, let's get up to altitude. Let's get a 30,000 foot view, look down here, and when you take them up to there, to why do you want this? What does value look like to you? And then you start fleshing that out. You end up coming down, and you end up in a different place on the ground to where you were at originally. So what actually they end up giving away is the original RFP or tender document or whatever. I mean, it's not uncommon, to give you an example, where you'll end up knowing about a deal and the bid document's already out, and some salespeople will immediately go and bid. Well, I guess my counsel is, if you have not been engaged with them, it's a waste of time bidding. Don't bid unless you know the buyers, you've engaged with them, and you clearly understand what the buying motivation is, what their perceptions of value. And so my advice in those situations is to derail the process, literally derail the process, get them to recall the bid. And the way you do that is by having a value conversation with them. You say, okay, so just hear me here. I just like to, because typically in the RFP, oftentimes the why isn't in there. There's a whole lot of technical stuff that might have a paragraph on overall, but no real idea of what the value is and what they're really, what this is really going to look like when it's working, and what's going to make a difference in their business. And so you have that conversation, and then you come down, and as you're having the conversation with them, well, how are you going to do this and how are you going to do that? They come to a realization that, well, actually, our RFP document doesn't really cater for that. That's something that's missing. And then they come to the realization, maybe we need to extend this period for the bids and issue an addendum or modification to flesh out the things that you've helped us discover. And actually, in that process, then we've ended up positioning ourselves as the preferred bidder, end up winning the deal.
Yeah, well, the person who's adding real value instead of just adding some fake value that really nobody cares about, right?
Yeah, well, why this really works, Phil, is you're not talking about your product or your service. I mean, when you talk your product, your service, by definition, that's self-interest. You're talking about yourself, right? And that undermines trust. Salespeople do that like from the get-go. As soon as they open their mouths, they start talking about their product or service. Do you like engaging with people that talk about themselves all the time? You don't. you don't tend to trust them. And that's what salespeople do from the get-go. So this process prevents that happening. You end up on the buyer's page having a conversation about them.
Wow. Wow. That's great. So that sounds like a much different, much more effective way to sell here. So how do we coach to that though, Patrick, right? If I'm a salesperson, if I'm a sales leader and I'm like, ooh, okay, I get this. How do I coach to that? How do I help that happen?
That's a really good question, Phil. Because what we're talking about here is a fundamental behavioral change. So our normal sales behaviors, we're hardwired to do that. Through generations, we've been used to attempting to persuade people to our point of view. And all of our traditional sales methodologies are like, convincing people, persuading people. That's kind of the negotiation, is the whole give and take. I'll give you this and you give me that. That's our paradigm. So when you get into value conversations, you throw that all out the window. And it's really a case of engaging as you would with a friend. So, and your most valuable attribute is curiosity. It's like what you exhibit. So how does that work? You're just naturally curious. That's the style of conversation to have. And when you're curious, you're showing interest in a person. And what happens when someone shows interest in you? You come to trust them because they're putting you first, not them. It's as simple as that. And that actually grows trust. And the more they trust you, the more they open up, the more vulnerable they become. And then you find out what they really value. Are they after recognition, advancement, greater responsibility, authority, less stress, more time with the kids? Those are the things that motivate people's buying behavior. And when they see that they're going to get those things working with you, then you become their preferred source of value.
That's so interesting. I mean, I to your point, I think asking questions and being present and finding out the real why, like, why would you want to be on the show? Why would you want to do this? Why would, how would this benefit you? Really does make people think beyond the, okay, well, this is the piece of paper I've got, and here's the 7 things on my RFP, to your point, and here's really why I'm doing it, right? And I think we also then sometimes get that pushback, because when we ask the why, sometimes people realize that maybe this job or this sale is going to make them obsolete. Is that a concern at all, Patrick? Have you seen that happen?
Well, yeah, potential. So certainly that was the case in the early days of IT. The sense, and to be fair, that was often the motivation of organizations. We can automate, we get rid of a bunch of people. Not a good motivation, but that's what was at the back of their mind, and their people knew it. But I think the style is, Phil, it's like the conversation you and I are having. I'm sure that you haven't got a checklist of a bunch of questions there to ask me, but that's how a salesperson rocks up. You don't rock up with your friends and have a session with a checklist. What you do, you're in the moment. You may ask a question to get going, and then if you listen, really listen, they will give you the cues for the next question. You say, well, oh yeah, so what happens then? And how does that work? And that is the skill to learn. To your question about how do you coach, it's about be in the conversation. And I guess the other thing is listen. Don't listen for. Salespeople are always listening for cues. They're listening for an opportunity to come in with some, oh yeah, well, I can fix this or I can fix that. Don't. Have a blank mind and just listen. And you will learn, you will come up with the next question.
Wow. So listen instead of listening for. Yeah, wow. I'm not normally speechless, but this is interesting, right? This is very different. This is like, okay, right? Slowing down the process and really being present is a very different sales conversation than most people have. So is it, okay, we're going to teach listening skills. We're going to teach people how to pay more attention and how to be more curious. So are some people naturally good at this, or does everybody need training, or how does this happen?
Yeah, they are. I should mention one of the other challenges is, we within sales operations, they talk about, their sales methodology or their sales process. And we have these set gates that we take buyers through, and awfully usually mapped in our CRM to our pipeline. So, we've got an inquiry, we've done a needs exploration, we've done a demo, we've done a presentation, we've prepared an RFP, we put them through these gates, right? That's our perspective, that's our world. That's not what buyers see. Buyers go on a journey in terms of understanding. So one of the things that needs to happen is to throw away the traditional sales cycle and think about a buyer journey and be sensitive to where the buyer is at in that journey. Now, for newbies, that can be a bit subtle. They could be in a state where the buyer really trusts them, but they don't actually realize that. Or they could be in a state where the buyer doesn't trust them and they don't realize that. And that's part of the coaching, is to learn how to know that. It's nothing more than developing your EQ, frankly, Phil. So to answer your question, people that do well are those who, or easily, I've got one guy in the program who's a psychologist, an organizational psychologist. He's been a really quick study in terms of understanding the program, because it just clicks in with him intuitively in terms of how people's brains work. And he's off to the races with the process, right? So that's really what it is. It's more a case of unlearning those old stereotypical habitual behaviors and just being present, being sensitive. It's the old story, the male-female thing. If you've got a female partner, she has a problem, our natural instinct is to dive in with a solution. And we sort of know that you're not supposed to do that, right? But we go do it, don't we? We're supposed to say, well, how do you feel about that? And even if you're talking to a guy, the same question works. Tell me how. Well, actually, I feel terrible. My boss is all over me. If I don't get this thing fixed, I'm probably going to miss my. That's the stuff that's, you fix that, that's value. That's what you want to find out about. Not all this clinical, well, I need to do this and I need to do that and I need to do something else. So the perception of value is some big thing to aim for, and it's not full of detail. It's just how you want to learn, how does the buyer want to feel, and you want them to feel that way.
Yeah. Wow. That's simple, and yet it's really hard. That's unlearning, to your point. That's everything that I've learned about sales. That's not in there. I can go grab a book. I'm not going to see that, Patrick, but it does. The way you say it, right? Being curious, being present, listening instead of listening for, asking deeper questions. That feels valuable to me, as well as, and certainly valuable to the buyer. And then getting to the buyer's journey. If we can get them to share that with us, like I've got one deal right now totally stuck. I know why it's stuck, because I got that shared with me. And I know it might be a week, it might be a month before it gets unstuck. That's not helping my quarter, but that's certainly gonna, right? But the value is, I know to be patient, and I also know every week to try, hey, where are we at here? Have you had that opportunity to have that conversation with the next person that I know needs to happen so that we can move the deal forward? That's so, that's so interesting, right? To understand that journey.
I'll give you another quick story. Another guy I'm coaching at the moment, he'd been working on this particular opportunity where the incumbent, it was a telecommunications deal, managed services deal, and the organizer, millions of dollars, that were going to go again with the incumbent, albeit they weren't that satisfied. And he'd done all the presentations and all the rest of it, but the guy was sort of, he had the last conversation with him and said, no, look, I think we'll just, we don't have time to revisit this. We're just going to go with it. And the seller, my guy, turned around and said, he said, that's probably the best thing for you to do. He said, you really don't need this kind of upheaval at the moment. I think going with your current supply is the best thing you could do. Next day, the guy rings him back and said, run me through your proposal again. The first time he'd done all of this, but he hadn't really listened. This time the guy paid attention. The thing that had happened was when the seller turned around to him and said, look, that's the best thing for you to do, he realized then that he genuinely had his best interests at heart. To the extent that he said, look, don't buy from me, go from them. That is the best thing for you. And because he had that assurance from that, my guy rang me up. He was blown away about the change in behavior. And I said, those are the subtle things that tend to happen. That they realize that, like, how do you trust someone? It's not as though a switch goes on. But in our sales cycles, in our pipelines, we have all these definitive gates we put everything through. But we're human beings. We don't go through gates. It's more subtle. And so as salespeople, we need to become attuned to that, to recognize the signs, to be present. And really, that's the skill that salespeople need.
Wow. So what CRM are you using to capture all this, Patrick? That's the question I've got, right? Because these are subtle cues. I don't see any sales process here that flips through this. So talk to me about, how do you document this? How do you make sure that we're on track?
Okay, very good question. I thought you'd never ask. So I've got it's a sales cycle. It uses an acronym, of course. Decide. The acronym is DECIDE. DECIDE. Okay. So the first stage is D, discover. Discover who the buyers are, who's making the decisions here, right? The second is E, engage with the buyers to grow trust. Okay. This isn't a needs exploration. This is value exploration, right? Then the C is collaborate. Collaborate in terms, I haven't mentioned a product or a service yet. If the buyers ask me, look, what do you do? What we will do is say, well, no, I don't even know if I can help you. Let's keep going about you. I want to know more about you. So it's all about the buyer. Then comes collaborate. Collaborate is the stage where you discover value gaps. All right. And there's methods to determine the difference between where they want to be, where they are now, that bit's gap, the value gap. The next is the I, where we invent. We invent a solution to close those gaps. And it's a generic solution in the buyer's language. So at the end of the invent stage, we have, okay, so if you've got this and it did this and you get this and it does that and then it does this and it costs that, because you've discussed cost at the same time, would you buy it? They're going to say yes or no. If they say no, why not? You go back through it. And if they say yes, that sounds good. Yes, I'll buy that. Then the next D is dovetail. Remember dovetail? I mentioned dovetail, and a lot of millennials don't know what a dovetail is, but it's how you draw the sides of a drawer. So here's the solution in their language. You dovetail your product. This is the first mention of your product. And you say, well, you know how you want this thing? Well, our bit of product will do this. You want this thing? Then our bit of product will do that. And you just go through. And then the last E is endorse, where they endorse it. They say, okay, I'll go for that. Well, of course they would, because they're buying their solution, not your product. The thing is that your product perfectly matches their solution. Wow. So you only mention product right at the very end of the cycle. You go through the entire process without talking about your product, your service, no presentations, no demos, no quotes, none of that.
Wow, that's so different, right? So discover who the buyers are, engage with the buyers to grow trust, collaborate to discover those value gaps, invent a solution to close the gaps, dovetail, connect your product and the solution, and then get their endorsement to move forward.
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Yeah, that we can do that, right? So decide how you're going to sell, right? And I would say decide if you're going to sell from real value or your value, right? Yeah. Much like you say, listen or listen for, it's whose value here do we have? And if we have the buyers at stake and they're the ones at the forefront, and they should be, let's be honest, we have a very different conversation and a very different process.
Absolutely. And decide is useful acronym in another way, because each one of those points is a decision point. You can tell, it's interesting, having a conversation with people that I coach, if they're having a problem, it's because I'll say, well, what stage you at? And they'll say, collaborate. And I'll say, but this conversation you've been having, what's that about? He said, well, that's invent. I said, yeah, you started inventing before you've agreed with the guy what you're going to invent. There's your problem. So back up. Stop trying to solve the problem. You haven't identified the problem well enough yet. So these are definite gates you can go through. The collaborate phase is, do I clearly understand the problem before I get into the position? Like, one of my favorite quotes is Einstein, who said, given an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes on the problem, 5 minutes on the solution. Think about it. Salespeople turn it the other way around. They spend all their time on the solution. They assume the problem without discovering the problem. So this is merely a process of understanding the problem clearly and getting consensus with the buyer before you proceed to try and solve it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And that probably works at home too, with your spouse. That'd probably be pretty good too, huh?
Funny. Because now we work from home, or we're working from home. My partner, who by the way is a counselor, often hears me. And then she come in after, she says, why don't you try that stuff with me? She's probably listening right now and going to come in and say, you sound so good when you do it with him. So, she just yelled out, yeah, I don't know if you've heard that,
That's funny. That's funny. Well, my wife is probably going to listen to this too and probably say the same thing, Patrick. It's simple stuff, right? The decide method is simple.
I'm nothing if not fallible.
Right? We're human, right? We're absolutely human. So I dig that, man. So cool. So if we're going to get started along this journey to being more value-based, is there something simple that folks can do? I mean, obviously, if they go to the salesnatural.com, you've got an offer of some great training and some excellent videos, some great resources for folks. But if we're going to start today and be a more value-based seller, a value-based leader, how do we do that, Patrick?
Okay, well, I got to walk the walk, right? I got to be of value. And so it starts right here. So if you visit my site, there's a resources menu item there. Under resources, there's some guides that you can download that take you through the processes I've been talking about, take you through the philosophy, why it works, how to do it. And I'm also a few weeks away from releasing a free version of my course, totally free, okay, online course. So that will be available. That will be available soon.
Wow, awesome.
That'll be a video course that take you through the whole process from soup to nuts, with demonstrations.
That's fantastic. So friends, if you're listening to this and this resonates with you, and you see that this is a different way to sell, I encourage you to check Patrick out. Go to thesalesnatural.com, get to know Patrick. Lots on his site. Connect with him on LinkedIn. Get to know him more. Know that he's on the other side of the world and is still giving value to me. So, Patrick, thank you, man, for sharing your Decide model, for giving away those resources, and for spinning my head around on how I can be a better seller and, to your point, a better husband. So, thank you, Patrick.
Okay. You're welcome, Phil. Thank you very much indeed for having me. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
My pleasure. Yeah, it sure has. Thank you.